Sometimes the people closest to us hurt us the most. Not with their words, but with their doubt. Garrett Hollis sat in his pickup truck outside the law office staring at the brass keys in his palm. They were old, heavy things, darkened with age and neglect. The kind of keys that belonged to something important, though he couldn't imagine what his father might have considered worth locking away. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant pines, reminding him of better times. Times when his late wife June would make coffee before dawn, and they'd sit on the porch planning their day together. Those mornings felt like a lifetime ago now. June had been gone 2 years. The cancer took her just when their son Dawson needed his mother most. Garrett had lost his job at Morrison's auto shop 6 months later, when the owner's son returned from college with new ideas about efficiency and payroll cuts. At 52 years old, Garrett found himself in a place he'd never expected. Broke, unemployed. Watching his relationship with his 16-year-old son crumble like everything else in his life. The lawyer, a thin man named Peterson with wire-rimmed glasses, had been polite but clearly eager to close Earl Hollis's estate. Garrett's father had been dead 3 months now, and this forgotten airfield hangar was all he'd left behind. "Your father was very specific about this property," Peterson had said, sliding the keys across his mahogany desk. "He wanted you to have it, though I have to say, Mr. Hollis, the land isn't worth much. It's an old airfield about 40 miles outside town. Been abandoned since the 70s. Garrett had nodded, unsurprised. His father had never been one for valuable gifts or grand gestures. Earl Hollis had been a quiet man who fixed things for a living. Radios, engines, anything mechanical that people brought to his cluttered workshop behind the house. He'd served in the Air Force during the Cold War, though he'd never talked about it. Garrett's childhood memories of his father were filled with the sound of tools on metal and the smell of machine oil, punctuated by long silences that felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. "There are some back taxes owed," Peterson had continued, shuffling through papers. "Nothing excessive, but you'll need to settle them if you want to keep the property. More debt." Garrett had almost laughed. It seemed fitting that even his father's final gift would come with strings attached. Obligations he couldn't afford. But something about the keys had made him pause. They weren't ordinary keys. They were substantial, military style with numbers etched into the metal. The kind of keys that suggested whatever they opened was built to last and meant to stay closed. Now, sitting in his truck with the engine running, Garrett studied the faded military photograph he'd found tucked inside the envelope with the keys. It showed his father as a young man in uniform standing next to what looked like an aircraft. Though the background was too blurred to make out details, Earl looked serious in that photo. Professional. Nothing like the tired man who'd raised Garrett with quiet disappointment and few words. His phone buzzed with a text from Lorraine, his older sister. "Don't waste money on Dad's junk. Just sell the land and be done with it." Lorraine had always been practical to a fault. She'd married well-lived in a nice suburb with her husband Dennis, and had opinions about Garrett's choices that she shared freely. She'd been the one to suggest Garrett was too emotional about their father's death, as if grief had an expiration date that Garrett had somehow exceeded. But it wasn't grief that made Garrett pocket the keys and start his truck. It was something else. A nagging sense that he'd never really known his father at all, and this might be his last chance to understand the man who'd shaped his life through absence as much as presence. The drive to the airfield took him through countryside he'd forgotten existed. past farms and forests that reminded him of hunting trips with his father when he was young. Those had been some of their best times together. Quiet hours in the woods where Earl's silence felt comfortable instead of judgmental, where Garrett could almost pretend they understood each other. The airfield appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, a collection of weathered buildings and cracked runways that spoke of decades of neglect. The hangar dominated the landscape, a massive curved structure of corrugated metal that had once been silver, but now showed patches of rust like battle scars. It was bigger than Garrett had expected, easily large enough to house commercial aircraft. He parked near the hangar doors and stepped out into wind that carried the scent of old metal and distant rain. The property felt abandoned, but not quite empty, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. Small trees had taken root in places where drainage had failed. But the basic infrastructure looked solid, built to last. The hangar doors were secured with a chain and multiple locks, including one that matched the military-style key in Garrett's hand. As he approached, he noticed details that suggested this place had once been far more sophisticated than a simple storage facility. The doors themselves were reinforced, designed to withstand more than weather. Warning signs, faded but still readable, indicated restricted access and government property. His father had owned government property. That didn't make sense. Garrett tried the first key, then the second. The third one turned with a solid click that echoed in the quiet air. The chain fell away with a metallic rattle that seemed too loud in the stillness. The hangar doors were heavy, requiring significant effort to slide open even a few feet. The gap revealed darkness so complete that Garrett's eyes needed time to adjust. When they did, he saw a space so vast it seemed to swallow the afternoon light streaming through the opening. The air inside was cool and dry, carrying scents of metal polish and something else he couldn't identify. Something that reminded him of his father's workshop, but more refined, more purposeful. His footsteps echoed as he walked deeper into the space. Each step revealed more of the hangar's unexpected sophistication. This wasn't a storage facility or an abandoned building. This was a workspace, carefully maintained and deliberately preserved. On one of the workbenches, Garrett found a flashlight that still worked. Its beam revealed the true scope of what his father had left him. The hangar stretched much further than he'd realized, and the covered objects were enormous, much larger than cars or trucks. Two massive forms beneath heavy canvas tarps that had been secured with military precision. As the beam swept across the space, it caught something that made Garrett's breath catch in his throat. The edge of a tarp had pulled away from one of the large objects, revealing a glimpse of sleek metal that gleamed despite decades of storage. Whatever was under those covers, it had been maintained with the kind of care his father had always shown his most precious tools. His phone rang. Dawson's name appeared on the screen. "Dad, where are you? You were supposed to pick me up an hour ago." Garrett had forgotten completely. The discovery had consumed him so entirely that the outside world had ceased to exist. "I'm sorry, son. I'm at your grandfather's property." The airfield. The what? Dawson's voice carried the familiar edge of teenage disappointment. "Dad, you're not seriously dealing with Grandpa's junk, are you? Mom always said he was a pack rat." June had said that, though, always with affection. She'd understood Earl better than anyone, somehow seeing past his silence to something worth patience and kindness. It's not junk, Garrett said, though he wasn't sure why he felt so certain. I think your grandfather was involved in something important, something he never told us about. A pause. Then Dawson's voice, cautious but curious despite himself. What kind of important? Garrett looked around the hangar, at the covered shapes and sophisticated equipment, at the evidence of secrets his father had kept for decades. I don't know yet, but I think we're going to find out. The workshop tools were what convinced Garrett that his father had been far more than a simple repairman. He returned to the hangar the next morning with coffee and determination, spending hours examining the workspace that occupied nearly a quarter of the hangar's space. What he found challenged everything he thought he knew about Earl Hollis. Arranged with military precision along custom-built workbenches, the tools represented decades of accumulated expertise and significant investment. These weren't the basic hand tools of a small-town mechanic. They were precision instruments designed for aerospace engineering. Digital calipers accurate to thousandths of an inch sat beside torque wrenches calibrated for aircraft specifications. Specialized gauges for measuring hydraulic pressure and electrical continuity filled drawers organized with systematic care that spoke of professional training. Most telling were the reference manuals, thick technical volumes covering advanced propulsion systems, avionics, and flight dynamics. Subjects far beyond anything Earl's official work history should have required. Garrett ran his fingers over a set of micrometers that probably cost more than he'd made in a month at the auto shop. These tools had been used regularly and maintained perfectly, their surfaces showing the gentle wear patterns of skilled hands performing delicate work. His father had been basically a rocket scientist, and Garrett had never known. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest like a physical force. All those years of feeling inadequate, all those silences he'd interpreted as disappointment. What if they'd been something else entirely? He found blueprint tubes containing detailed schematics for aircraft systems. File cabinets held maintenance logs going back decades, written in Earl's careful handwriting documenting work on aircraft designated only by project numbers and code names. The maintenance logs revealed a pattern of regular activity that had continued until just months before Earl's death. Whatever was under those tarps, he'd been caring for it constantly, checking systems, replacing components, ensuring everything remained in perfect working condition. But why? And why had he never told his family? Garrett spent that entire day alone in the hangar, photographing documents and trying to piece together the puzzle of his father's secret life. By evening, he had more questions than answers. But one thing had become clear. Earl Hollis had been protecting something important enough to dedicate 37 years of his life to its preservation. 3 days later, Garrett returned to the hangar with Dawson, a cooler of sandwiches, and enough curiosity to override his usual caution. His son had surprised him by asking to come along. Though Dawson spent most of the drive staring out the window with the practiced indifference of a teenager who'd learned not to expect much from his father's projects. "This better not be like when you try to restore that motorcycle," Dawson said as they pulled up to the hangar. "We spent 2 months on that thing and it never ran." Garrett winced at the memory. The motorcycle had been another attempt to connect with his son. Another project that had ended in frustration and disappointment, just like everything else since June died. "This is different," Garrett said, though he couldn't explain why he felt so certain. The massive doors proved even more challenging to open fully. It took both of them pulling together to slide them back far enough to let in substantial daylight. When they finally succeeded, the revealed space took Dawson's breath away. "Dad, this place is huge. What did Grandpa need all this room for?" The hangar stretched nearly 200 feet in length and at least 100 feet wide, with a curved roof that rose to 40 feet at its peak. The structure was clearly military-grade, built to specifications that far exceeded anything needed for civilian aircraft storage. The concrete floor was smooth and level, marked with painted lines and symbols that suggested organized, purposeful use. But it was the tarps that captured their attention now. In the full daylight streaming through the open doors, the covered shapes looked even larger than Garrett remembered, even more mysterious. "Help me with this," Garrett said, moving toward the nearest massive tarp. They worked slowly, methodically, unfastening the dozens of tie-downs that held the heavy canvas in place. The covering had been arranged to protect whatever lay beneath from decades of dust and moisture. As they peeled back, the material shapes began to emerge that made no sense for a civilian facility. The first thing Garrett saw was metal, not the rough, painted surface of farm equipment or automobiles, but smooth, precisely engineered aluminum that gleamed despite the years of storage. More of the tarp came away, and more. The nose was sleek, almost predatory, with air intakes positioned in ways that suggested speed and sophisticated aerodynamics. This wasn't a crop duster or small passenger plane. This was something designed for performance. "Dad," Dawson's voice was barely a whisper. "What is that?" Garrett couldn't answer, because he didn't know. The aircraft was like nothing he'd ever seen in person. It resembled military jets he'd glimpsed in magazines or documentaries, but the design was somehow both familiar and completely foreign. The proportions were elegant, purposeful, suggesting engineering that prioritized function over appearance, while achieving something beautiful in the process. They continued uncovering until the entire nose section was visible. Stenciled numbers on the fuselage read XJ-47. A Nighthawk 1, followed by smaller text that included NATO designations and a series of classification codes. Classification codes. On an aircraft hidden in his father's hangar, the cockpit canopy was intact, providing a view into an interior that looked far more sophisticated than anything Garrett had expected. The instrument panel was complex, filled with gauges and switches that suggested capabilities beyond simple flight. This aircraft had been designed for missions that required precision, stealth, and advanced technology. "We need to stop," Garrett said, suddenly stepping back from the partially uncovered aircraft. "We need to think about this." "What do you mean, stop, Dad? This is incredible. Grandpa had a military jet hidden in here. Do you know what this means?" Garrett knew exactly what it meant, and that was the problem. Military aircraft weren't the kind of thing civilians owned legally. If Earl had this jet, there was a story behind it. Probably a complicated story that involved governments and regulations and questions Garrett wasn't prepared to answer. But as he looked at his son's face, bright with genuine excitement for the first time in months, Garrett realized he couldn't walk away. Dawson was already pulling out his phone, taking pictures, asking questions about specifications and history. The sullen teenager had been replaced by a young man engaged with something that mattered. This was the first real connection they'd had since June's funeral. "Let's cover it back up for now," Garrett said. "But we'll come back tomorrow with better lights and more time." They spent the next hour carefully replacing the tarp and securing it properly. As they worked, Garrett's mind raced with possibilities and concerns. The lock mechanism suddenly made sense. If Earl had been hiding military aircraft, he would have needed security that could withstand decades of curiosity and investigation. But how had his father come to possess something like this? Earl had been an electronics technician in the Air Force, not a pilot or officer. He'd served during the Cold War, but had never spoken about classified work or special assignments. After his discharge, he'd worked as a civilian contractor for a few years before settling into the quiet life of a small-town repairman. Or so Garrett had always believed. On the drive home, Dawson peppered him with questions. Do you think there are more aircraft in there? What's under the other tarps? Why would Grandpa hide something like this? Is it legal for us to have it? Garrett didn't have answers, but he promised they'd find out together. For the first time since June's death, he had something that connected him with his son. A mystery that belonged to both of them. Inherited from a man who'd apparently kept the most important parts of his life hidden from everyone. That evening, Garrett sat in his small kitchen with a cup of coffee and his father's few personal papers, looking for clues he'd missed during the initial sorting after the funeral. Most of it was mundane. Insurance policies, utility bills, receipts for equipment purchases. But tucked between pages of a repair manual, he found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a letter typed on official letterhead, but with the organization's name carefully blacked out. The visible text was fragmentary. Project Nighthawk assets remain under your custodial care pending final resolution. Understood that disclosure without authorization. Grateful for your continued discretion regarding the humanitarian applications. The letter was dated 15 years ago and signed with an illegible signature above a title that had also been redacted. Garrett read it 3 times before the implications began to sink in. His father hadn't stolen military property or stumbled across abandoned equipment. He'd been entrusted with something, assigned to protect it, given a responsibility that had lasted decades beyond his official service. But why keep it secret from his family? Why die without explaining what he'd been guarding or why it mattered? The questions followed Garrett into a restless sleep, where he dreamed of his father working alone in the vast hangar maintaining aircraft that couldn't officially exist, carrying secrets that had isolated him from the son who'd never understood his silence. When he woke before dawn, Garrett knew 2 things with absolute certainty. He was going back to the hangar, and this time he was going to uncover everything his father had hidden. The keys felt different in his hand now, not like a burden or disappointment, but like a message. A final communication from a father who'd never found the words to explain himself while he was alive. Earl Hollis had been protecting something important enough to sacrifice his relationship with his family. Garrett intended to find out what that something was and why his father had trusted him to inherit the responsibility. The next week passed in a blur of discovery and growing wonder. Garrett and Dawson returned to the hangar every day, working together to document and catalog everything they found. The experience transformed their relationship in ways Garrett hadn't dared hope for. They uncovered the second aircraft, identical to the first, but designated XJ-47B Nighthawk II. Both jets were in remarkable condition, their systems preserved with the kind of care that spoke of regular maintenance and deep expertise. The workshop revealed more secrets: equipment for testing avionics systems, spare parts organized with military precision, documentation that traced the history of the aircraft back to their original construction in the early 1980s. But it was Earl's personal journals that provided the most insight into his secret life. Garrett found them hidden in a locked drawer, bound in worn leather, and filled with handwriting that grew increasingly shaky over the decades but never lost its careful precision. The early entries documented Earl's work as the project's chief maintenance engineer, his pride in the aircraft's capabilities, his belief in their humanitarian potential. These aircraft could change everything, Earl had written in 1985. They can reach places no other plane can access, deliver medical supplies to disaster zones, evacuate wounded from areas too dangerous for conventional aircraft. The technology is 30 years ahead of its time. Later entries revealed the political battles that had surrounded the project. Senators who worried about military applications. Bureaucrats who saw the aircraft as potential weapons rather than humanitarian tools. The eventual decision to cancel the program and destroy all prototypes. And then the entries that changed everything Garrett thought he knew about his father. Received orders today to dismantle and destroy all Nighthawk assets. Cannot do it. Cannot destroy something designed to save lives just because politicians fear it might be misused. There has to be another way. Earl had found another way. Working with sympathetic officers and civilian contractors, he'd arranged for the aircraft to be sold rather than destroyed. The purchase had been legal documented, funded by a trust, established by people who shared Earl's vision of the aircraft's humanitarian potential. And Earl had spent the next 37 years maintaining them. Alone, in secret, waiting for a day when they might finally serve their intended purpose. "Why didn't he tell us?" Dawson asked one evening as they sat in the hangar, surrounded by evidence of his grandfather's hidden life. Why keep all this secret for so long? Garrett had been wondering the same thing, but reading through his father's journals, he was beginning to understand. "I think he was protecting us," Garrett said, slowly. "Protecting me." He'd found an entry from 15 years ago written the day Garrett graduated from technical school. "Garrett finished his training today. Wanted so badly to tell him how proud I am. But how do I explain that I've spent his entire life protecting aircraft he can never know about? How do I bridge the distance that secrecy has created between us? He thinks I'm disappointed in him. The truth is, I'm terrified he'll inherit this burden before he's ready to understand it." The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. All those years of feeling inadequate, all those silences he'd interpreted as disapproval. His father hadn't been disappointed in him. Earl had been carrying a weight so heavy that he couldn't share it, and he'd sacrificed his relationship with his son to protect him from that burden. "Dad," Dawson's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you okay?" Garrett realized his eyes were wet. He wiped them quickly, embarrassed, then looked at his son. "I spent 40 years thinking my father was disappointed in me. Turns out he was trying to protect me from something he wasn't sure I could handle. And now you have to decide whether he was right." The words were surprisingly mature for a 16-year-old. Garrett studied his son's face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. Dawson wasn't just curious about the aircraft. He was watching how his father handled this challenge, learning from it. "I think he knew I could handle it," Garrett said finally. "That's why he left it to me." The hangar had become a second home. Garrett and Dawson spent every available hour there uncovering new details about the Nighthawk program and Earl's decades of secret guardianship, they learned that the aircraft had been designed with revolutionary efficiency. Advanced composite materials provided strength at half the weight of conventional designs. Hybrid propulsion systems combined jet engines with electric motors for silent operation during critical mission phases. Most impressive were the humanitarian mission modifications Earl had continued developing over the years. Medical bay conversions that could transform the aircraft into flying ambulances. Cargo configurations optimized for disaster relief supplies. Communication systems that could establish emergency networks in areas where infrastructure had failed. Earl Hollis hadn't just been maintaining these aircraft. He'd been improving them, adapting their systems for mission profiles that went far beyond their original specifications. "Look at this fuel efficiency data," Garrett said one afternoon, studying performance charts he'd found in the workshop. "These aircraft can reach anywhere in the world with a single refueling stop carrying payloads that would require multiple flights for conventional aircraft." Dawson traced the engineering drawings with growing appreciation. Grandpa was basically designing the perfect disaster response vehicle. Something that could get help to people who needed it no matter where they were or what conditions were like. And he did it alone. For 37 years. Without recognition or thanks. The scope of Earl's sacrifice was becoming clearer with each new discovery. He'd given up his relationship with his family to protect something he believed could save lives. He'd worked in isolation, maintained military-grade equipment, and kept secrets that would have overwhelmed most people. All because he believed the aircraft's humanitarian potential was worth preserving. One evening, as they were preparing to leave for the night, Garrett decided to stay. Something had been nagging at him, a feeling that he hadn't yet found everything his father had hidden. "Go home," he told Dawson. "Get some rest. I want to check a few more things." Dawson hesitated clearly, reluctant to leave. But exhaustion won out and he headed for his car with a promise to return early the next morning. Garrett waited until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. Then, he began a systematic search of areas they hadn't yet fully explored. The hangar was vast, and there were corners and compartments they'd only glanced at in their excitement over the aircraft. Now, alone in the quiet space, Garrett methodically examined every cabinet, every drawer, every potential hiding place. It was nearly midnight when he found the radio room. Hidden behind a false wall in the workshop, the space contained communication equipment that looked surprisingly modern. Shortwave radio setups with multiple frequency bands, antenna arrays, encryption devices. This wasn't abandoned equipment. The power indicators showed active systems. Someone had been maintaining these communications capabilities along with everything else. Garrett sat down at the main console studying the equipment. A logbook nearby documented monthly transmissions going back years. The most recent entry was dated just weeks before Earl's death. Control 7 contacted. All assets secure and maintained. No changes in condition or status. His father had been reporting to someone, regularly, for decades. The realization was still sinking in when the radio crackled to life. Garrett jumped, his heart suddenly pounding. The equipment hummed with power, and then a voice emerged from the static. Clear, professional, expecting a response. "Nighthawk Base, this is Control 7. Monthly status report requested on custodial assets. Please confirm." Garrett stared at the radio, frozen. The voice waited, then repeated the message. Nighthawk Base, this is Control 7. Acknowledge transmission. Protocol requires monthly status confirmation. His hands were shaking as he reached for the microphone. Part of him wanted to run, to pretend he'd never found this room or heard this transmission. But he was Earl Hollis's son, and his father had trusted him with this inheritance for a reason. He keyed the microphone. Control 7, this is Nighthawk Base. His voice was steadier than he expected. Earl Hollis passed away 3 months ago. I'm his son, Garrett. I've inherited the property and everything in it. The silence that followed stretched so long that Garrett wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. If he'd just revealed himself to people who might want these aircraft for purposes his father would never have approved. Then, the voice returned, different now. Still professional, but with an undertone of something that might have been surprise or concern. Nighthawk Base understood. Condolences on your loss. Earl Hollis he was a good man. Dedicated. A pause. Stand by for further instructions. Control 7 out. The radio went silent. Garrett sat in the darkness, surrounded by equipment he didn't fully understand, having just announced his existence to people whose identity and intentions were complete mysteries. His father had been part of something larger than a simple preservation project, a network of some kind. People who had supported his work and monitored his progress for nearly 4 decades. And now they knew that Earl was gone, that his son had taken his place. The implications were overwhelming. Garrett had stumbled into a world of secrets and responsibilities that went far beyond inheriting property or maintaining old aircraft. Whatever happened next, nothing would be the same. He thought about calling Dawson, about calling Lorraine, about calling anyone who might help him understand what he'd gotten himself into. But instead, he just sat there in the radio room listening to the quiet hum of equipment that connected him to people and purposes he was only beginning to comprehend. His father had trusted him with this, had believed he could handle whatever challenges it brought. Now Garrett would have to prove that trust was deserved. Outside the hangar, the Montana night stretched vast and dark, filled with stars his father had watched for 37 years, while guarding secrets that might finally be ready to emerge into the light. The keys in Garrett's pocket felt different now, not like an inheritance or a burden, like a beginning. Whatever his father had been protecting, whatever purposes these aircraft were meant to serve Garrett, was now their guardian. And he intended to be worthy of that responsibility. The days following the radio transmission felt like walking through a dream that might turn into a nightmare at any moment. Garrett couldn't stop thinking about that voice. Control 7. Someone out there knew about the aircraft. Someone had been monitoring his father's work for decades. And now they knew Earl was dead. They knew Garrett existed. He threw himself into research, spending hours online, searching for any information about Project Nighthawk. The results were frustrating. A few scattered references in declassified documents mentioned experimental aircraft programs from the 1980s, but details were either redacted or missing entirely. Aviation forums contained speculation about classified NATO projects, but no concrete information about aircraft matching the designations he'd found. The silence was telling. Projects that had been genuinely canceled usually left paper trails, historical analyses, even conspiracy theories. Project Nighthawk had been erased so thoroughly that it barely existed in the public record. Someone had wanted this program forgotten, but Earl Hollis had refused to let that happen. Garrett found his father's contact book in the workshop office filled with names and numbers written in careful handwriting. Most meant nothing to him, but one name appeared multiple times with notes suggesting regular correspondence. Dr. Miriam Aldridge, University of Montana, Aviation History Department. He made the call on a Tuesday morning, sitting in his truck outside the hangar with coffee growing cold in his hand. "Dr. Aldridge, my name is Garrett Hollis. I think you knew my father, Earl." A long pause on the other end, then a woman's voice, careful and measured. "Earl passed away recently, didn't he? I was sorry to hear about that. He was a remarkable man. You knew him. We corresponded occasionally about historical aviation projects. He was very knowledgeable about Cold War-era aircraft development." Another pause. "How can I help you, Mr. Hollis?" Garrett hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something in her voice suggested she already knew more than she was saying. "I've inherited some property from him. An old airfield with aircraft that I think might be historically significant. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand what I'm dealing with." The silence that followed stretched so long that Garrett wondered if the call had been dropped. "Mr. Hollis," Dr. Aldridge said, finally her voice carefully controlled. "I think we need to meet in person. Are you available tomorrow afternoon?" She arrived at the hangar the next day in a dusty sedan that had seen better decades. Dr. Miriam Aldridge was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She stood outside the hangar doors for a long moment, studying the structure with an expression Garrett couldn't quite read. Recognition, maybe. Or anticipation. "I've spent 20 years researching programs like this," she said quietly. "Most experts believe all the prototypes were destroyed when the projects were canceled. But they weren't. No." She turned to look at him directly. "They weren't. May I see them?" Garrett led her inside, watching her reaction as the hangar's contents came into view. She walked slowly around the partially uncovered aircraft, noting details, occasionally reaching out to touch the metal. With something approaching reverence. "XJ-47 Nighthawks," she said finally. "I've read every document I could find about this program, interviewed retired engineers, studied design specifications that were supposedly destroyed decades ago." She shook her head slowly. "And here they are. Both of them. In perfect condition. What were they designed for?" Dr. Aldridge turned to face him, her expression serious. "Officially, rapid deployment of humanitarian aid to remote or hostile areas. The design prioritized speed stealth and the ability to operate from minimal infrastructure. They could deliver medical supplies, food, or personnel to disaster zones that conventional aircraft couldn't reach safely." And unofficially, she met his eyes. "The same capabilities that make an aircraft perfect for humanitarian missions also make it valuable for intelligence gathering, special operations, covert supply runs. The project was canceled because certain political leaders worried about how the aircraft might be used if they fell into the wrong hands. So they gave them to my father instead of destroying them." "Your father was the project's chief maintenance engineer. He understood these aircraft better than anyone alive, and he had a security clearance that allowed him to be trusted with classified materials." She paused. When the political decision was made to cancel the program, someone high up chose preservation over destruction. The weight of inheritance suddenly felt much heavier. Garrett wasn't just the owner of valuable aircraft. He was the guardian of aviation history that powerful people had wanted to erase. "What's my legal position here?" he asked. "Can the government just take them back?" "That's complicated." Dr. Aldridge spread her hands. "The cancellation documents I've seen suggest the aircraft were transferred to civilian custodial care with specific conditions. But those conditions were classified, and I don't know what they entailed." Before Garrett could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed across the empty airfield. Multiple engines, moving fast. He stepped to the hangar doors and felt his stomach drop. A convoy of 3 black SUVs was pulling up to the entrance. Government plates, tinted windows. The kind of vehicles that appeared in movies when federal agents came to complicate someone's life. "Dr. Aldridge," Garrett said quietly, "I think we're about to have company." The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. She was younger than Garrett had expected, probably in her 40s, with short blonde hair and eyes that evaluated everything they saw. 2 men in dark suits flanked her, clearly security. But she was the one in charge. "Mr. Hollis," she extended her hand with professional efficiency. "I'm Agent Sandra Keller, Department of Defense. We need to discuss your father's custodial arrangements." Her handshake was firm, her manner direct but not unfriendly. Garrett sensed she was taking his measure just as he was taking hers. "I wasn't aware my father had custodial arrangements with anyone." "Mr. Hollis, your father was entrusted with assets that have significant implications for national security. His death creates certain administrative necessities." "You mean you want to take them back?" Agent Keller's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I mean, we need to assess the situation and ensure proper protocols are followed." Dr. Aldridge stepped forward. "Agent Keller, I'm Dr. Miriam Aldridge, University Aviation History Department. Are you familiar with the legal documentation surrounding Project Nighthawk's cancellation?" Recognition crossed Keller's face. "Dr. Aldridge, I've read your papers. This is a matter of national security that doesn't require academic consultation." "Actually, it does." Dr. Aldridge's voice was calm but firm. "The aircraft in this hangar represent one of the most significant aviation preservation efforts of the past 50 years. They have immense historical value that transcends their original military applications." Garrett watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about recovering government property. This was about competing visions of what the aircraft represented and how they should be used. "Agent Keller," he said, "I'd like to understand my legal position before discussing any transfers. My father maintained these aircraft for decades, apparently with official sanction. I inherited them along with the property and all associated responsibilities. Mr. Hollis, with respect, you don't have the security clearance or technical expertise to maintain classified military assets. Maybe not. But I have the legal ownership papers and 37 years of maintenance records that suggest this arrangement was intended to be permanent." Agent Keller's professional composure slipped slightly. "You have ownership papers." Garrett produced the documents he'd found in Earl's files. Title transfers, custodial agreements, letters that, while heavily redacted, clearly established Earl's legal rights to the aircraft and property. The agent examined the papers with obvious frustration, her brow furrowing as she turned page after page. Your father was supposed to destroy these aircraft in 1987, she said, finally. The preservation arrangement was never officially authorized. Then why did someone keep paying for parts and maintenance for 37 years? The question came from Dawson, who had arrived unnoticed during the confrontation. He held up a folder of financial records they discovered together. These are purchase orders for replacement components, specialized materials, all paid for by accounts that trace back to defense contractors. Dawson's voice was steady, more confident than Garrett had heard in months. Someone in the government has been funding this operation the entire time Grandpa was alive. Agent Keller studied the financial documentation, then looked at the maintenance logs, then back at Garrett. Her expression had shifted from confident authority to something more uncertain. Mr. Hollis, I need to make some calls. This situation is more complex than my briefing suggested. Take your time. Garrett gestured toward the workshop. We're not going anywhere. She stepped away with her phone, speaking in low tones that Garrett couldn't hear. Dr. Aldridge moved closer to him. Your father's documentation is remarkably thorough, she said quietly. He must have known this day would come eventually. He knew a lot of things he never shared. Men of his generation often did, especially those who served during the Cold War. Secrecy became a habit, a way of life. She paused. But he trusted you with all of this. That says something important about what he believed you capable of handling. Agent Keller returned her manner notably different than before. Less commanding, more collaborative. Mr. Hollis, I've spoken with my superiors. The situation with your father's ownership is more complicated than we initially understood. We're going to need time to review the documentation and determine the proper course of action. Meaning the aircraft stay where they are for now. But I'll need access to conduct a full assessment of their condition and capabilities. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than watching government trucks haul away his father's life's work. Fine, Garrett said. But I want everything documented, and I want to be present for any assessments. Agreed. Keller hesitated, then added something that surprised him. For what it's worth, Mr. Hollis, your father's reputation in certain circles is considerable. The people who knew about his work have tremendous respect for what he accomplished. Whatever happens with the legal questions, that legacy is secure. After the government vehicles departed, Garrett sat alone in the hangar, reading through his father's journals with new understanding. Earl had known this confrontation would come. He'd prepared for it carefully, assembling documentation that would protect his son's rights to the aircraft. Every legal angle had been anticipated, every potential challenge addressed. But it was the personal entries that affected Garrett most deeply. One passage written just 2 years before Earl's death stopped him cold. June died today. Garrett's wife. Wanted to comfort my son, but don't know how, without explaining why I've been absent from his life. The aircraft have been my responsibility for 35 years. But Garrett has always been my priority, even when he couldn't see it, even when my silence made him think otherwise. When I'm gone, he'll inherit both the burden and the opportunity, the burden of secrets I've carried alone, the opportunity to choose differently than I did. I hope he's ready. I hope he understands why I couldn't tell him sooner. I hope he forgives me for all the conversations we never had. Garrett had to stop reading. The tears came without warning, releasing decades of accumulated misunderstanding. His father hadn't been distant because he was disappointed. He'd been distant because he was protecting his son from a burden he didn't think Garrett was ready to carry. And now, finally, Earl had decided his son was ready. The inheritance wasn't just aircraft and property. It was trust. Faith in Garrett's ability to handle challenges that had defined Earl's entire adult life. That faith felt like the most valuable thing his father had ever given him. The next 2 weeks brought a cascade of developments that left Garrett struggling to keep up. Agent Keller returned multiple times, always professional, gradually revealing more about the network that had supported Earl's work. There were others like him, she explained. Civilians entrusted with classified technology that powerful interests had wanted destroyed. A quiet preservation program that operated in the shadows of official policy. "Your father was one of the originals," she said during one visit. "One of the first to refuse destruction orders and negotiate alternative arrangements. His success inspired others to do the same." Dr. Aldridge connected Garrett with aviation historians and military researchers who had spent careers trying to understand programs like Nighthawk. They arrived at the hangar with cameras and measuring equipment documenting the aircraft with scholarly precision. "These are priceless," one researcher told Garrett, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for their technology, but for what they represent. Proof that even during the most paranoid periods of the Cold War, some people prioritized humanitarian potential over military application." Dawson became increasingly involved in the documentation effort, his initial curiosity evolving into genuine passion. He studied the technical manuals, learned the systems, asked questions that impressed even the experts. "Your boy has talent," Dr. Aldridge observed one afternoon. "Natural understanding of aerospace engineering. He could have a future in this field if he wanted it." Garrett watched his son explaining aircraft systems to a visiting researcher and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pride. Not just in Dawson's intelligence, but in who he was becoming. The tragedy of June's death hadn't destroyed their family. It had just taken time for them to find their way back to each other. But the peaceful interlude couldn't last. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, Garrett received a legal summons that shattered the fragile equilibrium they'd established. North Corp Industries, a private defense contractor, had filed a federal lawsuit claiming rights to the Nighthawk aircraft. Their argument was aggressive and well-funded. The 1987 sale had been improper, they claimed. Classified technology couldn't be transferred to civilian ownership without proper congressional authorization. The aircraft were abandoned military property subject to salvage rights, and North Corp intended to exercise those rights. Their lawyers painted a picture of national security concerns. Advanced technology in unqualified hands. Potential threats to American interests. The need for proper corporate oversight of sensitive materials. But Garrett had learned enough about the company to understand their real motivation. North Corp wanted to reverse engineer the Nighthawk technology, study the aircraft's advanced systems, incorporate the innovations into new weapons programs that would generate billions in government contracts. They didn't care about preservation or humanitarian applications. They wanted to strip mine 37 years of Earl's work for profit. The lawsuit gave Garrett 14 days to respond. 14 days to prove his ownership rights or face a court order for temporary seizure of the aircraft. "This is serious," his lawyer told him during an emergency consultation. Phyllis Marchetti was a veteran of military contract disputes recommended by Colonel Boyd Sheridan, a retired officer who had served with Earl during the original Nighthawk program. North Corp has resources, political connections. They've won cases like this before by simply outspending their opponents. What are my options? Fight. Document everything. Build a case that your father's ownership was legitimate and that you're the rightful heir to that ownership. She paused. It won't be easy. And it won't be cheap. I'm already broke. Then you'll need to find resources. People who believe in what your father was doing. People willing to stand up against corporate interests. Garrett thought about the network agent Keller had described. The others, like his father, who had preserved technology the government wanted destroyed. If they existed now, was the time to find them. I'll make some calls, he said. The response exceeded anything he'd expected. Within days, offers of support poured in from sources Garrett hadn't known existed. Retired military officers who had worked on the original program, aviation historians who saw the case as a crucial test of preservation rights, veterans organizations outraged that a defense contractor would try to claim technology developed by American servicemen. Colonel Boyd Sheridan became a central figure in the emerging coalition. At 75, he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions. His white hair and weathered face spoke of experiences Garrett could only imagine. Your father and I served together during the Nighthawk development. Sheridan told Garrett during their first meeting. He was the best engineer I ever worked with, and the most principled man I've ever known. You knew about the preservation arrangement. I helped create it. Sheridan's eyes held memories that stretched back decades. When the cancellation order came down, Earl was the one who said, we couldn't destroy aircraft designed to save lives. Just because politicians were afraid of how they might be misused. He organized the resistance, negotiated the purchase agreement, took on the responsibility of guardianship when everyone else was ready to give up. Why didn't he ever tell me? Because he was protecting you. Sheridan's voice softened. The people who wanted these aircraft destroyed didn't simply go away. They've been watching, waiting. Earl knew that if he involved his family, he'd be putting you at risk. And now the risk exists regardless. North Corp has forced the issue into the open. The only question is whether we fight back or let them win. The old colonel's words crystallized something that had been forming in Garrett's mind since he first discovered the aircraft. His father had spent 37 years fighting alone, protecting something he believed in while sacrificing his relationship with his family. Garrett didn't have to make the same choice. He had allies now, people who shared his father's vision, a son who had found purpose in the discovery. Even his sister Lorraine had begun to come around, shocked by the scope of what Earl had accomplished. I had no idea, she'd said during a recent visit, standing before the aircraft with tears in her eyes. All those years I thought he was just a stubborn old man who couldn't let go of the past. And he was protecting something important, Garrett finished. Something worth fighting for. Then fight for it. Lorraine gripped his arm with unexpected intensity. Don't let those corporate vultures take what Dad spent his life preserving. The discovery of Earl's final letter changed everything. Garrett found it on a Thursday afternoon, hidden inside a compartment in the first aircraft's cockpit. The envelope was marked, "For Garrett when the time comes," in his father's unmistakable handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it. "My dear son, if you're reading this, then the moment I've been preparing for has finally arrived. You now face the choice I've been carrying for 37 years. Whether to preserve something important or surrender it to forces that would use it for purposes far removed from its intended mission. I know you've wondered why I kept this secret from you. Why I let you believe I was just a simple repairman when I was actually guarding technology that could change lives. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew you'd become a target. Afraid that the burden would crush you, the way it sometimes threatened to crush me. But I was also proud. Proud of the man you became without knowing anything about my secret work. Proud of your integrity, your kindness, your love for your family. These qualities are worth more than any technical knowledge or security clearance. You've probably learned by now that these aircraft were designed for humanitarian missions. Rapid delivery of medical aid to disaster zones. Evacuation of wounded from hostile areas. Supply runs to isolated populations that conventional aircraft couldn't reach. They could have saved thousands of lives if politics hadn't gotten in the way. I spent 37 years believing that someday the political climate would change enough to allow their humanitarian use. That day never came while I was alive. But perhaps it will come for you. The choice is yours now, son. You can sell the aircraft and secure your financial future. You can fight to preserve them and honor the vision that created them. Or you can find a third path that I couldn't see. Whatever you decide, know this: I have always been proud of you, always believed in you, always known that you would rise to whatever challenges life placed before you. You think I was disappointed in you. The truth is the opposite. You exceeded every standard that mattered to me: your heart, your honor, your love. Choose based on what will help the most people, not what will make the most money. Choose based on the man you are, not the man you think I wanted you to be. I love you, son. I always have. Dad, P.S. I've arranged for the aircraft to be preserved publicly if that's the path you choose. All necessary documentation is in the red folder behind my desk. The world deserves to know what we built and why it mattered. Garrett read the letter 3 times. Each reading brought fresh tears, fresh understanding, fresh determination. His father hadn't been disappointed in him, had never been disappointed. The silence that Garrett had interpreted as disapproval had actually been protection. Love expressed through sacrifice rather than words. 40 years of misunderstanding dissolved in moments, and in their place rose something stronger. A clarity of purpose that Garrett hadn't felt since June died. His father had trusted him with this responsibility, had believed he could handle challenges that had defined Earl's entire adult life, had faith that Garrett would make the right choice when the moment came. The court date was approaching. North Corp's lawyers were preparing their assault. The future of the Nighthawk aircraft hung in the balance. But Garrett knew now what he had to do. He found the red folder exactly where the letter indicated, filled with detailed plans his father had developed over years of secret preparation. Plans for converting the hangar into a public aviation museum and humanitarian training center. Earl had envisioned a future where the aircraft could finally serve their intended purpose, where people could learn about their history and potential, where the technology he'd preserved could inspire new generations to prioritize humanitarian applications over military ones. It was a beautiful vision, and Garrett intended to make it reality. "Dad," Dawson's voice came from the hangar entrance. "You okay?" "Ian." Garrett looked up from the plans, wiping his eyes. His son stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, tall and uncertain, still becoming the man he would eventually be. "I found something," Garrett said. "A letter from your grandfather, and plans he made for the future." Dawson crossed the hangar to stand beside his father, looking down at the documents spread across the workbench. "What kind of plans?" "Plans for a museum, a training center, a way to share what he built with the world." Garrett met his son's eyes. He wanted these aircraft to matter, Dawson, not as weapons or corporate assets, as tools for helping people. "So we're going to fight North Corp. We're going to do more than fight. We're going to win." Garrett gripped his son's shoulder. "Your grandfather spent 37 years preparing for this moment. Now it's our turn to finish what he started." Dawson nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what his father was saying. "What do you need me to do?" "Help me organize these documents. Coordinate with Dr. Aldridge and Colonel Sheridan. Reach out to the veterans organizations and preservation groups that have offered support. And the court case." Garrett thought about his father's letter, about the choice Earl had trusted him to make. "We show them exactly what these aircraft were designed for, and we prove that my father's vision deserves to survive." The hangar felt different now. Not like a burden or a mystery, but like a mission. Earl Hollis had spent decades protecting something important. Now his son would fight to ensure that protection meant something. The battle for the Nighthawk legacy was about to begin, and Garrett intended to honor his father's memory by winning it. The federal courthouse in Helena rose against the Montana sky like a monument to consequences. Garrett sat in his truck for a long moment before entering, studying the building's marble columns and American flags, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 14 days had passed since North Corp filed their lawsuit. 14 days of preparation, documentation, and sleepless nights. 14 days of discovering just how many people believed in what his father had built. The support had been overwhelming. Veterans organizations across the state had rallied behind the cause. Aviation historians had provided expert testimony about the aircraft's historical significance. Humanitarian groups had written letters describing how the Nighthawk technology could transform disaster response operations. Even Agent Keller had surprised him. During their final meeting before the hearing, she'd revealed that the Department of Defense would not be supporting North Corp's claims. "The documentation your father assembled is comprehensive," she'd said. "My superiors have reviewed everything. The 1987 sale was legitimate. Your ownership is legal." "Then why is this going to court?" "Because North Corp has money and lawyers and political connections. They're hoping you'll fold under pressure. Settle for whatever they offer just to make the problem go away." "And if I don't fold," Agent Keller had almost smiled, "then we'll see what happens when corporate greed meets genuine principle." Now walking into the courthouse with Phyllis Marchetti at his side, Garrett felt the weight of that principle pressing against his chest. This wasn't just about aircraft or money. This was about honoring a man who had sacrificed everything for something he believed in. The courtroom was larger than Garrett had expected, with high ceilings and wood-paneled walls that spoke of tradition and authority. Spectator benches were filled with supporters who had driven from across the state to witness the proceedings. Colonel Sheridan sat in the front row wearing his dress uniform for the occasion. Dr. Aldridge was beside him clutching a folder of historical documentation. Lorraine had come with her husband, Dennis. Their earlier skepticism replaced by something that looked like pride. And Dawson. His son sat directly behind the plaintiff's table, dressed in a suit that Garrett had bought him just for this occasion. The teenager, who had spent 2 years avoiding his father, now refused to leave his side. On the opposite side of the courtroom, North Corp's legal team occupied their table like an invading army. Clayton Hargrave, their lead attorney, was a silver-haired man whose expensive suit probably cost more than Garrett's truck. His associates shuffled papers with practiced efficiency. The bailiff called the court to order. All rise for the Honorable Dorothy Callahan. Judge Callahan entered through a door behind the bench. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. Her reputation preceded her. Fair but demanding, patient but intolerant of wasted time. She would decide the fate of everything Earl Hollis had spent 37 years protecting. Be seated. Judge Callahan reviewed documents on her bench for a long moment before looking up. This court is convened to hear the matter of North Corp Industries versus Hollis. Mr. Hargrave, you may present your opening argument. Clayton Hargrave rose with the smooth confidence of a man who had won many battles in rooms like this one. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about national security and proper stewardship of sensitive military technology. The aircraft in question were developed using taxpayer funds for classified military programs. They contain advanced systems that could pose serious risks in unqualified hands. He paused, letting the words settle over the courtroom. Mr. Earl Hollis may have been a competent technician during his military service, but he was never authorized to retain custody of classified assets after his discharge. The supposed sale of 1987 was irregular at best, fraudulent at worst. These aircraft belong in the hands of qualified professionals who can ensure they are properly secured and their technology protected. Hargrave turned slightly, his gesture encompassing Garrett without quite looking at him. The defendant is an unemployed mechanic with no security clearance, no aerospace expertise, and no legitimate claim to military property worth over $100 million. North Corp has the resources, the expertise, and the facilities to properly manage these assets. We ask the court to order their immediate transfer to appropriate custodianship. Judge Callahan nodded. Ms. Marchetti, your response. Phyllis Marchetti stood, her manner calm, but carrying an intensity that Garrett had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. Your Honor, Mr. Hargrave would have this court believe that Earl Hollis was some kind of rogue actor who improperly retained government property. Nothing could be further from the truth. She lifted a thick folder of documents. What I hold here is comprehensive documentation proving that the 1987 transfer was entirely legal. Earl Hollis and a consortium of military officers and civilian contractors legally purchased these aircraft when the Department of Defense chose to sell rather than destroy them. The sale was approved at the highest levels. Funding came from legitimate sources. Every requirement was met. Marchetti moved toward the bench, her heels clicking on the marble floor. For 37 years, Earl Hollis maintained these aircraft to operational standards. He filed regular reports with appropriate authorities. He received funding for parts and maintenance through established channels. He was not hiding stolen property. He was faithfully executing a custodial responsibility that the government itself had sanctioned. She paused, letting her words carry across the silent courtroom. North Corp claims to be concerned about national security, but their real interest is commercial exploitation. They want to disassemble these aircraft, reverse engineer the technology, and incorporate the innovations into weapons systems that will generate billions in government contracts. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Judge Callahan's expression remained neutral, but her eyes had sharpened. Earl Hollis dedicated his life to preserving aircraft designed for humanitarian purposes: rapid disaster response, medical evacuation, supply delivery to isolated populations. He believed this technology could save lives, and he refused to let it be destroyed for political convenience. Marchetti turned to face the courtroom. His son, Garrett Hollis, has inherited that responsibility. He intends to honor his father's vision by establishing a public museum and training center where these aircraft can educate future generations about humanitarian aviation. This is exactly what Earl Hollis wanted, and it is exactly what the original preservation agreement intended. She returned to the plaintiff's table. We ask the court to dismiss North Corp's claims as legally baseless and affirm Mr. Hollis's rightful ownership of his father's legacy. The hearing proceeded through the morning, each side presenting evidence and calling witnesses. North Corp's experts testified about security protocols and the dangers of classified technology in civilian hands. Garrett's team countered with documentation proving the legitimacy of the original sale and Earl's ongoing compliance with custodial requirements. Dr. Aldridge took the stand to explain the aircraft's historical significance. Her testimony was passionate and precise, painting a picture of Cold War innovation and humanitarian potential that had been sacrificed to political paranoia. These aircraft represent one of the most advanced designs of their era, she said. Technology that was specifically developed to save lives in crisis situations, to reach people that no other aircraft could reach, to deliver hope when hope seemed impossible. Colonel Sheridan followed his military bearing, lending weight to every word. I served with Earl Hollis during the Nighthawk program, he testified. He was the finest engineer I ever worked with and the most principled man I ever knew. When the order came to destroy these aircraft, he was the one who stood up and said no, who insisted there had to be another way. And you supported that decision? Marchetti asked. I helped organize it, because Earl was right. You don't destroy something built to save lives just because politicians are afraid of hypothetical misuse. You find a way to preserve it until the world is ready to use it properly. Objection, Hargrave interjected. Colonel Sheridan's personal opinions about military policy are not relevant to the legal questions before this court. Overruled. Judge Callahan's voice was firm. The witness may continue. Sheridan looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, I've spent my entire adult life serving this country. I've seen good decisions and bad ones made at the highest levels. Earl Hollis's decision to preserve these aircraft was one of the best I've ever witnessed. He gave up everything: his career, his relationship with his family, his own comfort and security, all because he believed in something larger than himself. His voice hardened. North Corp doesn't want to protect national security. They want to profit from technology that better men than them work to preserve. Earl Hollis spent 37 years guarding these aircraft. His son deserves the chance to honor that legacy. The lunch recess provided a brief respite from the intensity of the courtroom. Garrett sat in a conference room with his legal team reviewing the afternoon strategy. "We're doing well," Marchetti said. "The documentation is solid. The witnesses are compelling, but North Corp will make their strongest push this afternoon. They'll try to paint you as unqualified to manage sensitive assets. What can I do about that? Tell your story. Explain what these aircraft mean to you, why you want to preserve them." She paused. "And let Dawson testify if he's willing. His perspective could be powerful." Garrett looked through the conference room window to where his son sat in the hallway studying notes he'd made about his grandfather's work. He wants to speak. He's been preparing for days. Then let him. Sometimes the most effective testimony comes from unexpected sources. The afternoon session began with North Corp calling their own experts. Aerospace engineers who testified about the complexity of maintaining military aircraft. Security consultants who described theoretical risks of technology falling into wrong hands. But their arguments felt increasingly hollow against the weight of documentation and personal testimony that Garrett's team had assembled. Then Hargrave made his final move. "Your Honor, we call Garrett Hollis to the stand." Marchetti leaned close. "He's going to try to make you look incompetent. Stay calm. Tell the truth. Remember why you're here." Garrett walked to the witness stand, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom following him. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down to face the most important interrogation of his life. Hargrave approached with a predator's patience. "Mr. Hollis, what is your current occupation?" "I'm unemployed. And before that, I was a mechanic at Morrison's auto shop." "A mechanic." Hargrave let the word hang in the air. "Not an aerospace engineer, not a military contractor. A small-town mechanic who fixed cars for a living." "That's correct." "And yet, you believe you're qualified to maintain aircraft worth over $100 million, aircraft with classified technology that could potentially be used to harm American interests." Garrett met the lawyer's eyes steadily. "I believe I'm qualified to honor my father's legacy. He spent 37 years protecting those aircraft. He trusted me to continue that work. And yes, I believe I can live up to that trust. With respect, Mr. Hollis, believing something doesn't make it true. Your father had military training, security clearances, decades of specialized experience. You have none of those qualifications." "You're right. I don't have my father's technical background." Garrett's voice was calm but carried an edge that made Hargrave pause. "But I have something else. I have his documentation, his maintenance records, his contacts in the aviation preservation community. And I have people who actually knew him willing to help me understand what he was protecting and why it mattered." "So you're admitting you can't maintain these aircraft yourself?" "I'm saying I don't have to do it alone. My father built a network of supporters over 37 years. Engineers, historians, military personnel who shared his vision. They've offered to help me preserve these aircraft properly, to establish the museum and training center my father planned." Garrett leaned forward slightly. "North Corp wants you to believe this is about qualifications. It's not. It's about intentions. My father intended these aircraft to serve humanitarian purposes. I intend to honor that vision." North Corp intends to strip them for parts and profit. Objection, Hargrave said quickly. The witness is speculating about my client's intentions. Withdrawn. Garrett settled back in his chair. Let me rephrase. North Corp is a defense contractor. Their business is building weapons. What humanitarian applications do they have in mind for these aircraft? Hargrave's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to witnesses who fought back. This isn't about what North Corp intends, Mr. Hollis. It's about what's appropriate for sensitive military technology. Actually, it is about intentions. These aircraft were designed to save lives. That was their original purpose. My father spent his life preserving that purpose. The question before this court is whether that purpose will continue or whether it will be sacrificed to corporate profit. Judge Callahan intervened. Mr. Hargrave, do you have further questions for this witness? The lawyer hesitated, clearly reassessing his strategy. No further questions, Your Honor. Marchetti stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to call one additional witness, Dawson Hollis. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Garrett watched his son rise from the spectator bench and walk toward the witness stand with a composure that seemed beyond his 16 years. The bailiff administered the oath. Dawson sat down, his eyes finding his father's for a brief moment of connection. Dawson, Marchetti began gently. Can you tell the court about your relationship with your grandfather? Dawson was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I didn't really know him. Not the way I should have. He was always quiet, distant. I thought he was just a grumpy old man who fixed radios and didn't have much to say. When did that perception change? When my dad found the aircraft. Dawson's voice strengthened. When I saw what Grandpa had been doing all those years. The maintenance logs, the technical improvements, the plans he made for a museum that could teach people about humanitarian aviation. He looked toward the spectator benches where Colonel Sheridan sat in his dress uniform. I've been reading his journals, learning about the decisions he made, the things he gave up to protect those aircraft. He could have had a normal life, a relationship with his family. Instead, he chose to guard something he believed in. Alone, for 37 years. Why do you think he made that choice? Because he believed the aircraft mattered more than his own comfort, more than being understood. He thought someday they could actually help people, save lives in disasters, reach places that nobody else could reach. Dawson paused. He was willing to be misunderstood his whole life, if it meant preserving that possibility. Marchetti nodded. And what do you think should happen to the aircraft now? Dawson straightened in his chair, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. My grandfather died without ever telling us about the most important work of his life. He protected something bigger than himself, and he did it without recognition, without thanks, without anyone understanding what he was doing. His eyes moved to the North Corp table. Those people want to take what he built and tear it apart, study it for weapons technology, turn something designed to save lives into something designed to end them. Then he looked at his father. My dad wants to honor Grandpa's vision, build the museum he planned, train people to use the aircraft for humanitarian missions, continue the work that Grandpa couldn't finish. Dawson turned to face Judge Callahan directly. Your Honor, I'm 16 years old. I don't know much about law or military technology or corporate disputes, but I know this: my grandfather was a good man who made sacrifices that I'm only beginning to understand. He deserved better than to have his life's work stripped for parts by people who never met him and don't care about what he believed in. His voice wavered slightly but held firm. I think he would want people to learn from his example, to see that sometimes protecting something important means giving up things you want for yourself. That's what those aircraft represent to me. Not money, not technology. A lesson about what it means to believe in something larger than yourself. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Callahan studied the young man before her with an expression that Garrett couldn't quite read. Then she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Hollis. You may step down." Dawson returned to his seat behind his father. As he passed, Garrett reached out and gripped his son's hand briefly. A moment of connection that said more than words could express. Closing arguments followed, but they felt anticlimactic after Dawson's testimony. Hargrave repeated North Corp's concerns about security and qualifications. Marchetti summarized the evidence supporting legitimate ownership and humanitarian intent. Judge Callahan listened to both without expression. "This court will recess for deliberation," she announced when the arguments concluded. "I will render my decision within the hour." The waiting was excruciating. Garrett sat in the conference room with his legal team surrounded by supporters who had given so much to reach this moment. Colonel Sheridan shared stories about Earl's early career. Dr. Aldridge reviewed the historical significance of the case. Lorraine held her brother's hand without speaking, and Dawson sat beside his father, no longer the distant teenager who had spent 2 years avoiding connection. The trial had changed him. Or perhaps it had simply revealed who he had always been capable of becoming. "Whatever happens," Garrett said quietly, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. What you said in there, your grandfather would have been amazed." Dawson nodded slowly. "I meant every word. I just wish I'd understood sooner, while he was still alive." He knew. Garrett thought about his father's letter about the faith Earl had placed in his son's character. "He always knew what you were capable of, just like he knew what I was capable of even when I couldn't see it myself." The bailiff appeared in the doorway. "Judge Callahan is ready to deliver her ruling." The courtroom felt different as everyone took their seats for the final time, charged with anticipation, heavy with consequence. Judge Callahan entered and settled behind her bench, reviewing notes for a long moment before looking up. "This case has presented complex questions about military technology, civilian ownership, and the nature of legacy. Both parties have presented compelling arguments, and I have considered them carefully." She removed her reading glasses. "The documentation submitted by the defense is comprehensive and convincing. The 1987 sale of the Nighthawk aircraft was conducted through proper channels with appropriate authorization. Earl Hollis's custodial arrangement was legitimate, sanctioned by relevant authorities, and executed faithfully for 37 years. Garrett felt his heart pounding. "Furthermore," Judge Callahan continued, "the evidence demonstrates that Earl Hollis was not merely storing classified property. He was actively maintaining, improving, and preserving aircraft of significant historical and humanitarian value. His work represents one of the most dedicated preservation efforts this court has ever encountered." She turned to face the North Corp table. "The plaintiff's claims of improper transfer and salvage rights are not supported by the documentation presented. The concerns about security and qualification, while theoretically valid, Do not override the clear legal ownership established through proper military channels decades ago. Judge Callahan's voice carried the weight of final authority. It is therefore the ruling of this court that the Nighthawk aircraft and all associated materials are the legitimate property of Garrett Hollis, inherited through proper legal succession from his father, Earl Hollis. North Corp Industries' claims are dismissed in their entirety. Relief flooded through Garrett like a physical wave. Additionally, the judge continued, this court commends the Hollis family for their commitment to preserving these aircraft for educational and humanitarian purposes. The vision outlined in Earl Hollis's plans represents exactly the kind of stewardship that sensitive historical technology deserves. She gathered her papers. This case is closed. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Supporters rushed forward with congratulations. Colonel Sheridan saluted crisply. Dr. Aldridge wiped tears from her eyes. Lorraine embraced her brother with fierce intensity, but Garrett's attention was focused on his son. Dawson stood slightly apart from the celebration, watching his father with an expression of quiet pride. When their eyes met, the teenager smiled. A real smile. The first genuine smile Garrett had seen from him in 2 years. They embraced without words, holding on to each other in the midst of chaos and celebration. Earl Hollis's legacy had been preserved, and his family had finally been healed. The press conference outside the courthouse drew more attention than Garrett had expected. Local news crews jostled with national outlets, all wanting to hear from the man who had just won a $100 million inheritance. Garrett stood before the microphones flanked by Marchetti and Colonel Sheridan, with Dawson just behind him. The questions came rapid fire. Mr. Hollis, what are your plans for the aircraft? Will you be selling them? How does it feel to be worth $100 million? Garrett waited for the noise to subside. Then he spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. $111 million. That's what those aircraft are worth according to the appraisers. I could sell them today and never worry about money again. Pay off every debt. Buy a nice house. Retire comfortably. He paused, looking out at the cameras and reporters. But my father didn't spend 37 years protecting those aircraft, so I could trade them for a bank account. The crowd grew quieter. Earl Hollis was a simple man by most measures. Fixed radios for a living, kept to himself. Never sought recognition or reward, but he carried a secret his entire adult life, a responsibility that most people couldn't even imagine. Garrett's voice strengthened. He believed those aircraft could save lives, could reach people in disasters that no other plane could reach, could deliver hope to places where hope had been abandoned. And he refused to let that potential be destroyed, just because politicians were afraid of how it might be misused. He looked toward Dawson. My son asked me what I intended to do with the aircraft. I told him I was going to honor his grandfather's vision. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Garrett faced the cameras directly. I'm announcing the establishment of the Earl Hollis Aviation Heritage Center. The hangar where my father worked for 37 years will become a public museum dedicated to the history of humanitarian aviation. The Nighthawk aircraft will be preserved and displayed, telling the story of technology designed to save lives rather than end them. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Additionally, we're creating training programs for disaster response personnel, teaching them about rapid deployment techniques, remote area operations, and the kind of missions these aircraft were originally designed for. If we're ever able to get proper authorization, those aircraft will fly again. Not for military purposes, for humanitarian ones. A reporter called out, "Mr. Hollis, are you saying you're giving up $100 million? I'm saying that some things are worth more than money." Garrett smiled slightly. My father understood that. He taught me to understand it too, even though it took me 40 years to learn the lesson. What about North Corp will they appeal? They can try, but the documentation is clear. The ownership is legal, and the purpose is exactly what my father intended. His voice hardened slightly. These aircraft were built to help people. They're going to continue helping people. That's not negotiable. A final question came from the back of the crowd. "Mr. Hollis, what would your father say if he could see this moment?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the letter hidden in the cockpit, about the faith his father had placed in him, about the relationship they'd never had because of secrets that couldn't be shared. I think he would say that he's proud, that the sacrifice was worth it, that the burden he carried alone for so long has finally found its purpose. His voice caught slightly. And I think he would say that he always knew I could handle it, even when I didn't believe that myself. 6 months later, the Earl Hollis Aviation Heritage Center opened its doors. The hangar that had hidden secrets for nearly 4 decades was transformed into something beautiful. Professional exhibit designers had created displays telling the story of Project Nighthawk, focusing on its humanitarian mission parameters and the dedication of personnel who had believed in technology's potential to serve humanity. Interactive stations allowed visitors to explore aircraft systems, learn about disaster relief operations, understand the engineering innovations that made humanitarian aviation possible. The aircraft themselves remained the centerpiece. Positioned under carefully designed lighting, they gleamed with the care that Earl had given them for 37 years. Detailed placards explained their capabilities, their history, and their continued readiness for humanitarian missions should proper authorization ever be granted. Opening day brought crowds that exceeded everyone's expectations. Families with children who gazed at the aircraft with wonder. Veterans who stood before the displays with tears in their eyes. Aviation enthusiasts who had traveled from across the country to see technology they had only read about. Garrett stood at the entrance greeting visitors with a warmth that would have surprised anyone who knew him a year ago. The unemployed mechanic had become a museum director, a preservation advocate, a keeper of his father's flame. Dawson had become the center's most popular guide. His genuine enthusiasm and deep knowledge of the aircraft's history made him a favorite with visitors of all ages. The hybrid propulsion system allows these aircraft to operate silently during critical mission phases. He explained to a group of engineering students, "Imagine being able to deliver medical supplies to a disaster zone without alerting hostile forces, or evacuating wounded personnel without compromising their location." Watching his son Garrett felt pride that went beyond words. The angry teenager had been replaced by a young man with purpose and direction. Dawson had applied to study aerospace engineering, determined to understand what his grandfather had built and perhaps continue improving it. Dr. Aldridge served as chief curator, ensuring historical accuracy while developing educational programs that connected the aircraft story to broader themes of innovation and service. Colonel Sheridan visited regularly, often bringing other veterans who had served during the Cold War. Their stories added layers to the museum's narrative, connecting the aircraft to the broader history of military personnel who had chosen service over recognition. Even Lorraine had found a role. As a member of the board of directors, she brought business skills and community connections that proved invaluable in establishing the center as a respected cultural institution. International humanitarian organizations had begun discussions about potentially activating the aircraft for real emergency operations. Red Cross representatives, Doctors Without Borders, personnel and United Nations humanitarian coordinators had all visited to assess capabilities. The conversations were preliminary but promising, suggesting that Earl's vision of humanitarian service might eventually be realized. On the evening of the opening ceremony, after the crowds had departed and the exhibits had been secured for the night, Garrett found himself alone in the hangar. The space felt different now. No longer a place of secrets and isolation, but a place of education and hope. The aircraft that his father had guarded alone for so many years were finally sharing their story with the world. Garrett sat on a workbench reading from Earl's journal by the soft glow of maintenance lighting. Legacy is not about personal achievement. It is about creating something that will continue serving others long after the creator is gone. His father's words echoed through the empty hangar. 37 years of dedication, sacrifice, faith that someday the moment would come when his work could finally be shared. That moment had arrived. Footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. Garrett looked up to find Dawson approaching. "Thought I might find you here." His son sat beside him on the workbench. "Couldn't sleep. Just thinking about your grandfather. About everything he gave up to preserve this place." Dawson nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that too. About what it must have been like for him, working alone all those years. Knowing he could never explain to his family why he was so distant. He did it because he believed in something." Garrett looked up at the aircraft gleaming in the low light. "Something worth sacrificing for. Do you think he would be happy with how things turned out?" Garrett thought about his father's letter, about the faith Earl had placed in his son, about the relationship they'd never had because of secrets that couldn't be shared. "I think he would be amazed, not just by the museum or the aircraft, by you." Dawson looked at his father, surprised. "By me. He wrote about you in his journals, about hoping you would find purpose, meaning, something worth dedicating yourself to." Garrett smiled. "I think he would be incredibly proud of the man you're becoming." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, father and son, united by a legacy that had finally brought them together. "Dad," Dawson's voice was quiet, "I've made a decision about college." "Oh, I want to study aerospace engineering. Not just as a career, but to understand what Grandpa was protecting. Maybe continue improving it." He paused. Continue his legacy. Garrett felt something swell in his chest. Pride, gratitude, hope for a future that suddenly seemed brighter than anything he had imagined. Your grandfather would have wanted that. More than anything. "I know." Dawson looked up at the aircraft. "That's why I'm doing it. Not for the degree or the career, for him. For what he believed in." They stood together looking at the Nighthawk aircraft that had brought so much pain and so much healing to their family. "Thank you, Dad." Garrett turned to his son. "For what?" "For not giving up." for fighting when it would have been easier to walk away, for showing me what it means to honor something larger than yourself. The words hit Garrett with unexpected force. All those years of feeling like a failure, a disappointment, a man who could never measure up to standards he didn't understand. And here was his son thanking him for the same qualities his father had seen all along. "Your grandfather believed in me," Garrett said slowly, "even when I didn't believe in myself. He trusted me to carry this forward, to make the right choices." He put his arm around Dawson's shoulders. "And now I believe in you, the same way he believed in me." They walked out of the hangar together, father and son, leaving the aircraft to their quiet vigil under the Montana stars. The building that had hidden secrets for 37 years now held something more valuable than classified technology. It held hope. Hope for humanitarian missions that might finally serve their intended purpose. Hope for a family that had found its way back to each other through tragedy and discovery. Hope for a future built on the foundation of one man's extraordinary sacrifice. Earl Hollis had spent his life protecting something important. His son had honored that protection by sharing it with the world. And his grandson would carry the legacy forward into a future that none of them could have imagined. The hangar doors were closed now, but what they contained was no longer secret. It was a gift to the world that Earl had served, to the family he had loved, to all the people who might someday be saved by aircraft designed not for war, but for mercy. Garrett looked back one final time at the building that had changed everything. Then he walked into the night with his son, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The burden had become a blessing. The secret had become a story, and the man who had inherited his father's silence had found his own voice at last.